The letter came on a Tuesday morning at 10:27 a.m. I remember the time because I had just sat down with a cup of coffee, scrolling through meaningless emails when the envelope slid under my apartment door, like it had been waiting for the perfect moment. No return address, just my name, written in a thin, deliberate hand, Ethan Ward. I almost tossed it aside with the rest of the junk mail, but something about the smell of the paper stopped me. It had that scent of cedar and old books, like a forgotten room left untouched for years. Inside was a single sheet of stationery and a legal envelope. The letterhead read, Law Office of Pearson Holbrook, Fairbanks, Alaska. I frowned. I had never been to Alaska. The letter was short. Dear Mr. Ward, we regret to inform you of the passing of your uncle, Garrett Ward. You are listed as his sole surviving heir and have inherited his property and remaining estate located in the Hollow Ridge area of Alaska. The deed, keys, and final correspondence from your uncle are enclosed. Sincerely, Nathan Holbrook, Escon. There was no signature from my uncle, just a folded note in the same envelope. It was yellowed at the edges, the handwriting rough and hurried, written by a hand that had trembled but refused to stop. Ethan, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. The cabin and everything in it are yours now. But before you decide to stay, read these rules carefully. Obey them like your life depends on it. 1. Never leave the cabin between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. 2. Ignore any voice that calls your name from outside. 3. Always wear something red when you go into the woods. 4. If you see a man in a blue suit near the tree line, do not speak to him. 5. Do not open any locked wooden boxes. 6. Never forget Rule 1. Garrett, I read it twice. Then a third time. It felt like a joke, something written by an old man losing his grip. But the more I stared at the shaky letters, the more unease crept in. The rules didn't feel like nonsense. They felt deliberate, like someone had lived by them. I folded the paper carefully and set it aside, trying to shake the feeling crawling up my neck. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. By the weekend, curiosity had eaten through hesitation. I called the number listed in the lawyer's letter. A calm voice confirmed everything. Yes, the property was real. Yes, it was remote. Yes, I was the only heir. When I asked about my uncle's death, the lawyer hesitated. Officially, he said, exposure, but the sheriff's report mentioned the cabin door was found open at 2:46 a.m. A chill settled in my stomach. I flew into Fairbanks 2 weeks later. The air smelled like ice and pine, crisp and endless. From there, a worn pickup truck waited with the keys left in the ignition. A handwritten note on the dashboard simply read, Hollow Ridge, follow the mile markers. Stop at 19. It was already 4:30 p.m. when I left the small town behind. The sun dipped low, turning the snowfields into sheets of molten gold. By the time I reached marker 19, daylight had drained completely. The cabin stood at the end of a narrow path, half buried in snow. Logs blackened with age, a chimney leaning slightly to the side. Windows shuttered tight. It looked like the kind of place that had learned how to survive without people. I parked the truck, grabbed my duffel and trudged up the frozen steps. The front door resisted, groaning like something asleep being forced awake. Inside smelled like dust and pine tar. A single lantern sat on the table beside a folded piece of red cloth, a scarf maybe, and a brass key tied to it with twine. Next to the key was another note. Same handwriting as before. Do not stay past midnight on your first night. Listen before you sleep. You will understand why. The power generator behind the cabin still worked. I flipped it on and dim light spilled across the single-room interior. Bed, wood stove, shelf of old books, and a long wooden chest pushed against the far wall. The chest was padlocked. I thought of Rule 5. That first night, I built a fire, unpacked, and sat listening to the wind scrape across the eaves. It was quiet, unnaturally quiet. Around 11:30 p.m., I began to feel it, the sense that the cabin was listening too. The silence deepened until I could hear my own heartbeat. Then came a sound from outside. 3 knocks. Not at the door. On the wall, slow, even, deliberate. I froze. The note had said, listen before you sleep. Another 3 knocks. Same rhythm. I told myself it was a branch, a loose shutter, anything but what it sounded like. Someone standing just outside the wall. The clock ticked toward midnight. I forced myself into bed, pulling the blanket over my head like a child hiding from shadows. But the knocking didn't stop. It moved from the wall to the window. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath. Then, a voice, soft, close, familiar. "Ethan, you left the door unlocked." My body went cold. The voice was mine. I waited until 3 a.m. before moving again. The air had gone still. The cabin felt normal, if you ignored the ice creeping up the inside of the glass. I checked the door. It was locked. Outside, the snow was undisturbed. No footprints. No branches. Just perfect white. But drawn in the frost on the window were 3 words: "See you again." I left the cabin at dawn, breathing steam and disbelief. The forest looked harmless in daylight. Birds called from high branches and sunlight broke through the pines like golden glass. I told myself I'd imagined it. The knocks, the voice, everything. Sleep deprivation, stress. But when I stepped off the porch, something caught my eye. A spot of color in the snow, bright and wrong. A strip of fabric, red, the same as the scarf inside. I bent to pick it up and found that it wasn't lying on the snow. It was under a thin layer of ice. Frozen there, something had left it before the snowfall. Inside the cabin, I found another piece of paper tucked inside one of the bookshelves. Different handwriting this time, smaller, neater. Dated 3 months before Garrett's death. He is still out there. The man in the blue suit. He stands near the trees at 2 a.m. and waits. He does not breathe. He does not blink. The red keeps him away, but only if you wear it. I think he wants to be invited in. I stared at the words until the letters began to blur. Then I saw the photo taped to the bottom of the page, a faded Polaroid of the cabin porch. Snow falling, a man in a blue suit standing among the trees, head tilted slightly as if listening. The timestamp in the corner read 2:01 a.m. That night, I wore the red scarf. I didn't know why, but it felt safer somehow. Like armor. The firelight flickered across the walls and every shadow looked like it was holding its breath. At 1:42 a.m., I heard the crunch of snow outside. Not wind, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, careful. They circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped near the back door. I moved quietly to the window. Between the trees stood a man in a blue suit, his skin pale against the dark. He faced the cabin but didn't move, didn't even shiver in the cold. The moonlight glinted off something in his hand, a brass key. My uncle's key. I stepped back from the window. When I looked again, he was gone. By morning, there were footprints circling the cabin, sharp, precise, as if someone had paced the perimeter all night. I followed them a few yards into the woods before they ended abruptly, mid-step. The snow beyond was untouched. The air there felt wrong, thick, electric. Something in the trees was watching. I went back inside and sat at the table, staring at the rules again. They didn't feel like madness anymore. They felt like instructions. As I traced my fingers over the paper, a gust of wind rattled the window. For a second, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't my face looking back. It was smiling. That night, I dreamed of the cabin door. I was standing outside knocking, and from inside, a voice that sounded just like mine whispered, "Come in, Ethan. It's safe now." When I woke, it was 2:03 a.m. and the front door was wide open. Morning thawed the edge off the cold, but the silence outside still pressed against the cabin like heavy snow. I made coffee on the propane stove, thick, bitter, chemical smelling, and watched steam ghost across the window where those 3 words had been traced. "See you again." The frost had melted, but a faint outline lingered like fingerprints beneath glass. I tried to distract myself by exploring the cabin. The living area opened into a narrow hallway leading to 2 small rooms, a pantry and what looked like my uncle's study. His handwriting filled dozens of yellow notepads, lists of dates, fragments of weather reports, names of birds, phases of the moon. The latest page ended mid-sentence, 2:14 a.m., footsteps again circling east to west. Whistling stopped when I turned on the lantern. A chill went through me. Whistling, I hadn't heard that. Not yet. The rest of the morning I shoveled the steps and cleared a path to the generator shed. Beneath the snow I found the faint shape of boot prints, deep, narrow, too long for any normal shoe. They led toward the tree line and vanished. By 12:40 p.m. the sky had turned pewter gray. I thought about leaving, but the road down the ridge was already a glassy slide of ice. No one would drive it till spring. I was stuck. I decided to stay one more night. Just one. Curiosity felt safer in daylight. Around 6 p.m., I cooked canned beans, read a little from one of Garrett's journals, and found a folded photograph pressed between the pages. It showed the cabin porch decades earlier. No snow, no decay, and a man I didn't recognize standing beside Garrett. The stranger wore a dark suit and tie. On the back of the photo, scrawled in pencil, were the words, "He offered to buy the place." I told him no. Something about the handwriting looked rushed, angry. When the wind rose that evening, the sound carried a low whistle through the stovepipe. 3 rising notes, then a pause. I remembered the journal line and felt my skin tighten. I jammed a towel into the vent, but the tune kept threading through the walls, as if the wind itself were practicing. By 9:15 p.m., snow began falling again, a fine white veil swirling under the porch light. I wrapped myself in a blanket and reread the rules for the 10th time. I didn't believe them, not really, but each one felt like a lock clicking shut around the night. I spoke them aloud, quietly, testing my uncle's words in my own voice. When I finished, the lantern flame shivered and dimmed. A muffled knock answered from the far side of the room, soft, almost polite. I turned, heart hammering. The sound came again, closer this time from beneath the floorboards. 3 slow taps, pause, 3 again. My hands shook as I reached for the lantern. Its light bled through the cracks between the boards, illuminating the seams in quick pulses. Something moved under there, tiny vibrations like a hand brushing wood grain from below. I whispered, "I hear you." The motion stopped. The rest of the night blurred between dozing and listening. Every time I began to drift, a new sound rose. Creaking steps, a breath at the window, the faint metallic scrape of something against the front door. At 2:47 a.m., the handle turned halfway before stopping. I didn't move again until the first thin light of dawn slid through the curtains. Daylight didn't bring peace, but it did bring decision. I needed to know what was beneath the floor. I pried up the loose boards near where I'd heard the knocking. Underneath lay a crawl space no higher than my knee. The soil was hard-packed and cold, and something glinted among the dirt. Metal hinges. I brushed away earth until a small wooden hatch appeared, fitted with a padlock identical to the one on the chest. Rule 5 echoed in my head. Do not open any locked wooden boxes. Technically, this was a hatch, not a box. My mind twisted that loophole like a key between fingers. I didn't open it. Not then. I covered it back up and told myself I was respecting the rule, though the truth was fear, plain and simple. That afternoon, I hiked the trail behind the cabin. The snow came up to my knees and the forest closed around me in long black trunks. The air smelled of iron and sap. I wore the red scarf knotted tight at my throat. Each time the wind shifted, I thought I saw something blue between the trees, a flicker like cloth. But when I blinked, it was gone. At the end of the trail, I found a small clearing, and in its center a crude wooden cross half buried in snow. No name, just carved initials. G.W. Garrett Ward. My uncle had built his own grave marker. I stumbled back to the cabin, throat dry, lungs burning in the thin cold. The sun was sliding down behind the ridge, bleeding orange through the trees. Inside, I poured whiskey from an old bottle on the shelf and tried to steady my hands. Exposure, the lawyer had said. But a man who digs his own grave before dying of cold doesn't die by accident. As the clock crept toward midnight, I made a plan. Stay awake, keep the lantern burning. Prove to myself that the rules were superstition. I wrote them again on a blank page just to defy them. Each pen stroke felt heavier than the last. At 12:16 a.m., the cabin sighed, wood shifting under the pressure of wind and frost. The fire hissed low. I stared into the glass of the lantern and saw movement behind my reflection. A shadow passing from one side of the room to the other. I turned. Nothing. Just the chest, the table, the door. Then came the voice. It drifted from outside, muffled through the wall. "Ethan, it's freezing." "Let me in." It sounded like Garrett, aged and pleading. I swallowed hard. "You're dead," I whispered. The voice answered, quieter now, closer to the wood. "Then who wrote the 7th rule?" There were only 6. I snatched the lantern and stepped backward until my shoulders hit the wall. My pulse roared in my ears. The voice faded, replaced by the low whistle in the stovepipe. Those same 3 rising notes. When the clock finally struck 3 a.m., every sound stopped at once, like someone cut a wire. I collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, red scarf still tight around my neck. The next thing I knew, sunlight poured through the cracks in the shutters. The door was closed again, locked from the inside. Pinned to it with an old nail was a scrap of paper torn from my notebook. 6 rules rewritten in my own handwriting, and beneath them, a new line added in fresh ink. 7. If you hear your own voice outside, do not answer. That was the moment I stopped calling it coincidence. That was the moment Hollow Ridge began to learn my name. Morning light in Hollow Ridge has a strange way of lying. It pours through the window, warm and golden, like the kind that could wake you in a safe, ordinary house. But underneath, everything still feels wrong. The air is too still, the woods too quiet. The silence watches back. When I woke that day, the memory of the 7th rule burned in my mind. The paper was still nailed to the door, my handwriting identical but shakier, like something had guided my hand. I spent the first hour convincing myself I had done it in my sleep. Maybe I'd written it under stress, half-conscious, trying to rationalize what I'd heard the night before. But then I noticed something else. The ink was fresh, still slightly wet. I hadn't touched a pen since the night before. I made coffee, poured half of it down the sink, and decided to distract myself. The generator needed more fuel. The pipes were starting to freeze again. Work always kept my head steady. Outside, the snow had thickened. The footprints I'd seen circling the cabin yesterday were gone, erased clean. Even the wind sounded different now. Instead of howling, it hummed low and rhythmic, like something deep underground. I told myself I'd be gone soon. Just a few days, I'd gather Garrett's things, then leave this cursed place behind. But curiosity doesn't care about fear. And that crawl space under the floor, the one with the locked hatch, kept whispering at the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. Around 2 p.m., I gathered the tools, a hammer, a pry bar, and a flashlight. I pried up the boards again. The metal hinges stared up at me through the dirt, dull and ancient. The padlock looked fragile. A little pressure would snap it clean. Rule 5 burned in my memory. Do not open any locked wooden boxes. I knelt there, heartbeat thudding. The hatch was technically part of the floor, but my brain kept twisting the definition. Not a box, I told myself. It's a door. A door to what, though? That was enough to make me stop. I covered the hatch back up, but before I nailed the boards down, I noticed something carved into the wood along the frame. Help me find it. The letters were carved rough, uneven, fresh enough that the edges hadn't darkened with age. Find what? I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing. Every corner of the cabin seemed smaller than before. The air carried faint smells of smoke and metal, like someone had been burning wire in the stove. At 5:37 p.m., I heard something fall from the shelf in the study. A book had tumbled open on the floor, its spine cracked, revealing a page folded in half. Garrett's handwriting again. If you see them, do not run. Running means they can follow. The man in the blue suit waits for those who break the circle. Red keeps you visible, but visibility is not safety. Underneath, scrawled smaller. If you hear your name twice in the same breath, leave the cabin before dawn. That night, I wore the scarf again. The wind had died completely. The world outside looked frozen mid-breath. I sat by the window, flashlight off, watching the dark. At 12:27 a.m., a faint tapping started near the far wall. Not the solid knock-knock I'd heard before. Softer, fingertips, then a whisper. Ethan. Silence, then again. The exact same tone, pitch, and breath. Ethan. Twice in one breath. I froze. Garrett's warning replayed in my head. If you hear your name twice in the same breath, leave before dawn. I grabbed my coat, flashlight, keys, and then realized the truck was half a mile down the trail. Outside, the forest was still. The snow squeaked under my boots as I forced myself toward the path. The cold bit through my jacket, sharper with every step. When I looked back, the cabin lights were flickering. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing inside by the window, a man wearing a blue suit, his face turned toward me. The trail was buried deeper than I remembered. Branches hung low with snow, the trees pressing close like ribs of a giant cage. Halfway down, I heard footsteps behind me. Crunch, crunch. I stopped. The steps stopped. I moved again, faster. Crunch, crunch. When I turned, there was no one there. Only the faint shape of footprints appearing freshly in the snow, one after another keeping pace with mine. I ran. By the time I reached the truck, my hands were shaking too hard to fit the key in the ignition. I looked up and froze. The headlights reflected off the trees ahead, but between them stood someone. Tall, still, dressed in that same blue suit. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. I blinked and he was gone. The engine finally caught and I reversed down the trail, heart pounding. I didn't stop until the cabin's roof vanished behind the bend. I parked near the old frozen bridge a mile away, killed the headlights, and waited. For hours I sat in silence watching the woods. Nothing moved. At 3:02 a.m. my phone buzzed. No service for miles, yet the screen lit with a notification. One new voice message. Unknown number. I pressed play, static first. Then my own voice whispering, "Come back, Ethan. The rules changed." I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and drove until the engine coughed itself quiet. When dawn came, I turned back. Logic said the message was impossible. My brain needed proof that I wasn't losing it. The cabin stood as I'd left it, snow up to the porch, door closed. Smoke still curling from the chimney, but I hadn't left the fire burning. Inside, the smell hit first, metallic, sour like wet coins. On the table sat the wooden chest that had been padlocked. The lock lay beside it, broken clean open. Something inside the box was ticking softly. A small clock, its face cracked, hands frozen at 3 a.m. Beneath it, folded paper. I unfolded it carefully. "You broke the 5th rule. Now he can follow you anywhere." The rest of that day passed in a blur of dread. I packed, tried to call the lawyer, anyone, but the signal bars stayed dead. By 9:45 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 0. I sat by the fire staring at the broken lock, wondering if I'd somehow opened the chest in my sleep. That's when I heard the voice again, this time not outside, but from behind me. "Ethan." It came from the crawl space under the floor. I grabbed the lantern and crouched, heart racing. The floorboards were trembling slightly, like something underneath was breathing. Then the voice spoke again. "Do not leave. He's already in the woods." I leaned closer, the lantern shaking in my grip. "Who are you?" "Garrett." My blood froze. "I told you not to open the box," it said, softer now, almost pleading. "He watches through the cracks." The lantern flickered once, twice, then went out. The fire dimmed to embers. In the darkness, I heard the floorboards creak. A new sound joined it. Soft footsteps on the porch, slow and steady. Then a knock. 3 times. And from outside, a voice that wasn't mine, wasn't Garrett's. Deeper, smoother. "Good evening, Ethan." The door handle turned. I held my breath as it clicked open an inch. Cold air poured in, thick and heavy, carrying the smell of cedar and something else. Cologne. The man in the blue suit stepped into the glow of the dying fire. His eyes were empty, pupils black pits stretching wider than they should. He smiled politely. "You broke a rule." I couldn't move. He placed something on the table, the red scarf. It was soaked dark with blood. Then he said very softly, "Midnight to 3, remember?" I must have blacked out because the next thing I remember was waking on the floor with sunlight cutting across my face. The door stood open. The snow outside was untouched again. The scarf lay neatly folded where he'd placed it. The blood was gone, and on the wall, carved deep into the wood beside the rules, was a new line. 8. The man in the blue suit can only knock 3 times. The 4th one is you. I have tried to piece the days together since the man in the blue suit appeared, but the hours bleed like ink in water. I know I woke that morning, 9:12 a.m., maybe later, because sunlight was streaming through the open doorway, and the snow outside glittered like a million shards of glass. I told myself to leave. Pack, walk, anything, yet I stayed. Fear roots you to the floor when running means the thing you fear will follow. The cabin felt smaller, every wall breathing faintly. When I tried to close the door, the hinges shrieked as if protesting. I nailed a board across it anyway and dragged the heavy chest in front for good measure. That was the first mistake of the day. The next few hours passed in a haze. I found a bundle of Garrett's notes wedged behind the stove. pages glued together with damp. The writing was frantic, all caps in places. He copies what he sees. He learns through repetition. When he knocks, he is asking permission. Never answer your own voice. Another line farther down. If you break a rule, write a new one before nightfall. My stomach turned. I hadn't done that. At 4:23 p.m., the generator sputtered and died. The silence that followed was absolute. I opened the hatch outside and checked the fuel, still half full. I cranked it again. Nothing. Then faintly from somewhere in the woods came that same low humming I'd heard before. Not mechanical. Human. It was humming my father's favorite tune, something I hadn't heard since I was 12. I backed toward the porch. The humming stopped, and in that stillness the smell of cologne drifted faintly through the snow. By 6 p.m., dusk blurred everything into blue shadows. I moved a chair against the wall and sat watching the fire. The scarf lay folded on the table beside me, dry now, as if it had never been wet. I kept the rules sheet on my lap. 6 original, then the ones added after. 7. If you hear your own voice outside, do not answer. 8. The man in the blue suit can only knock 3 times. The 4th one is you. I stared at the blank space below, wondering how many more would come before it ended. Sleep finally came around 11 p.m., shallow and uneasy. I dreamed of Hollow Ridge from above, the cabin a single glowing dot in an ocean of trees. From the woods, hundreds of faint red shapes moved closer, circling it like embers caught in wind. When I woke, the fire was dead. The lantern flickered once, twice, then flared bright enough to burn white, and in that light, sitting across from me, was a man wearing my face. He smiled, polite, the way strangers do on elevators. "You were supposed to write the 9th rule," he said. Then the lantern went dark. I woke again at 2:11 a.m. on the floor, drenched in sweat. My reflection was gone from the window. The glass showed the room perfectly, the bed, the chair, the fire, but where my figure should have been, there was only empty space. I turned slowly toward the wall. A shadow stood there, long and sharp, cast by nothing. When I moved, it stayed still. Then it began to copy me a second later, like a film lagging behind. I whispered, "What are you?" The shadow tilted its head in the same motion. Delayed by that same impossible heartbeat, it whispered back, "Ethan." I grabbed the rule sheet, flipped it over, and wrote with shaking hands. 9. Do not trust your reflection after the 8th rule. The moment I lifted the pen, the shadow vanished. By dawn, snow had sealed the cabin's door again. I shoveled it clear and found a trail of small prints leading away from the porch. Bare feet, long-toed, each step pressed deeper than the last. They led into the forest until the trees swallowed them. I followed for a while, red scarf tied around my throat. Half a mile in, the air changed. Every sound died. Even my breathing felt muted. And then I saw him. The man in the blue suit stood 30 feet ahead, perfectly still, facing away from me. He was humming again. The same tune. "Garrett?" I called before I could stop myself. He turned slowly. The face that looked back wasn't Garrett's, and it wasn't the stranger's. It was mine. The thing smiled. "You shouldn't have spoken." The trees shook once like a breath exhaled. The world folded in on itself. When I blinked, I was back inside the cabin, kneeling beside the hearth, my hands covered in soot. The clock read 3 a.m. For the next 2 days, time unraveled. Sometimes the sun rose twice. Sometimes I would open a door and step into the same moment again. I stopped sleeping. The walls began to whisper names. Paul, Jeremy, Tyler, Max, David, 5 voices murmuring, always in sequence, always ending with mine. On the 3rd morning, the whispers turned to screams, and every window in the cabin cracked at once, written in the frost across the glass, "Red is not enough." Write the last rule. That afternoon, a snowstorm swallowed the ridge. Visibility dropped to nothing. I packed what little I had and made a run for the truck, but the forest had changed. Where the trail should have been, a corridor of identical trees stretched endlessly in every direction. I ran for what felt like hours, but every path led me back to the same clearing, Garrett's grave. Only now, the cross bore my initials. A fresh mound of snow lay beneath it, shaped too perfectly to be natural. I screamed until my throat tore raw, but the forest absorbed the sound. When I stumbled back to the cabin, night had already fallen. The door stood open, heat spilling out like breath. Inside, the man in the blue suit waited by the fire. His smile was gentle. "You are learning," he said. "One more rule and it is finished." I tried to speak, but no sound came. He raised a gloved hand and pointed at the table. A clean sheet of paper lay there, a pen beside it. "Write it," he said. "What happens if I do?" His grin widened, showing nothing but black. "Then you will understand why Garrett stayed." My hand moved before I could stop it. The pen scratched across the paper. I didn't recognize the words until they were done. 10. The last rule must be written in blood. The man in the blue suit nodded once, satisfied. Then he faded like smoke, leaving the smell of cold iron behind. When the clock struck 3 a.m., a drop of blood rolled from my nose onto the page, sealing the sentence. The fire died instantly. Outside, something enormous moved through the trees, a shape as wide as the ridge itself crawling on unseen limbs. The cabin trembled, and from the darkness came a whisper, thousands of voices braided into one. "You wrote the 10th rule. Now we can begin." The night after I wrote the 10th rule, time lost its grip. When I opened my eyes again, I could not tell if minutes or days had passed. The cabin smelled of smoke and copper. The paper with the blood-written rule still sat on the table. The drop dried into a small dark star. Outside, wind clawed at the windows, but it did not sound like wind. It sounded like breathing. I told myself I would not look outside. I looked anyway. The forest was moving, not swaying with the weather, moving like a tide of dark shapes pushing through the trees. Each figure wore a faint shimmer of red echoing the scarf around my neck. They were all me. Hundreds of reflections, some older, some younger, each one walking toward the cabin in perfect rhythm. At 12:10 a.m., the first one reached the porch. It knocked once, twice, thrice. Rule 8. The man in the blue suit can only knock 3 times. The 4th one is you. I stared at the door, waiting for the 4th. It never came. Instead, the handle turned. I backed away as the door opened and a version of myself stepped inside. Same coat, same scarf. Eyes wrong. Too flat, too calm. He smiled faintly. "You did not write the last line," he said. "There is no last line," I answered. "There always is." He pointed at the page. My hand, his hand, moved at the same time, tracing invisible letters on the air. Words burned across the paper by themselves. 11. If you finish reading, he finishes becoming. My reflection's smile widened. Now we are almost done. The generator outside roared to life on its own. Lights blazed. The cabin's walls shuddered as every surface began to hum. Photographs fell from shelves, curling in heat that came from nowhere. The other me stepped forward. "Garrett tried to end it by writing too few rules," he said. "You wrote too many." "I can stop this," I whispered. "You already started it." He reached into his coat and pulled out the red scarf. The one on my neck vanished like smoke. "Who are you?" I asked. He leaned close, voice almost kind. "I am the version that followed the rules." Then he pressed the scarf against my chest and the room exploded in light. When I came to, I was lying in the snow 50 feet from the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney in a slow, steady column. No footprints led back to where I lay. My hands were burned, palms etched with faint letters that spelled only one word: stay. I stumbled to my feet and forced my way to the door. It opened easily. Inside, everything was neat. The table set, the fire burning evenly, and sitting in my chair writing in the journal was Garrett. He looked up, eyes bloodshot but alive. "Took you long enough," he said. I couldn't speak. "You should not have written the 10th rule," he continued. That gave him shape. "Who?" Garrett's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the forest had gone still again. "The one who listens. The one the rules were written to keep asleep." He stood, joints creaking, and pressed the journal into my hands. "You can end it if you understand the pattern." The pages were filled edge to edge with numbers, dates, times, coordinates, every rule mapped to a precise sequence. Midnight to 3, 3 knocks, 3 minutes of silence, 10 written lines. "It's a cycle," Garrett said. "Every word is a door. You write enough doors he walks through." Something heavy shifted beneath the floor. The boards bulged upward. A crack opened, releasing a gust of freezing air that reeked of soil and rot. Garrett backed toward the hearth. "He's coming through the crawl space." You brought him close when you bled on the paper." From below came a slow scraping like bone on stone. I grabbed the red scarf and tied it around Garrett's wrist. "If it hides us, maybe it hides you too." He shook his head. "Red marks the living. He wants the living." The floor split open. What rose from beneath was not a man. It was a shape wearing humanity like clothing that didn't fit. Stretching, shifting, always smiling. The suit was the same dark blue, now soaked and glistening. Where eyes should have been, two pits of moving black churned. He spoke in both our voices. "Rule 12, he said. "When you understand the ending, you take his place." Garrett shoved me toward the door. "Run, Ethan." I stumbled into the snow, the storm slicing across my face. Behind me, wood splintered and a roar shook the ridge. I ran until my lungs screamed. The forest seemed endless. Branches tore at my jacket. The scarf ripped loose and vanished into the dark. When I finally collapsed, I realized I was no longer running uphill. I was on flat ground. The highway. Headlights glowed in the distance. A pickup screeched to a stop. A man jumped out, tall, middle-aged, face lined with worry. "You all right, buddy? You came out of nowhere." He offered his hand. "Name's David, let's get you warm." I nodded numbly and climbed into the truck. The clock on the dashboard read 2:59 a.m. We drove in silence for several minutes. My pulse began to slow. The storm faded behind us, then David chuckled softly. "You're lucky I was passing through Hollow Ridge. Not many folks drive this road after midnight." Something in his tone made me glance over. He was wearing a blue suit. Under his coat, "Don't worry," he said. "Eyes black as the road. I always keep the rules." The truck's clock clicked over to 3:00 a.m. I woke at sunrise behind the wheel, parked in front of a small town gas station. No sign of David, no truck. Just my own car idling, keys in the ignition. A folded paper lay on the passenger seat. Garrett's handwriting. "You survived the 12th hour. The cycle resets. Keep the rules. Pass them on." Beneath it, a blank sheet with only one fresh line written in red ink. 1. Never leave the cabin between midnight and 3. The rest of the page waited. Empty. Expectant. That was 3 months ago. I sold my apartment, packed the essentials, and started driving north again. The closer I get to Hollow Ridge, the clearer the rules feel in my head. Maybe Garrett was right. Maybe the only way to end it is to finish what we started. The forest is visible from the highway now, black and patient under the snow. I can see the cabin light already burning through the trees, welcoming me home. It is 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes until the first rule begins again.